There are people who walk through life believing they hold an invisible remote control over everyone around them. They study reactions, they memorize emotional triggers, and they slowly learn how to press the right buttons to get the response they want. For someone with a narcissistic mindset, control becomes more than a habit. It becomes an identity. They begin to see relationships not as partnerships, but as systems to manage. Compliments are tools. Silence is a weapon. Attention is currency. Over time, they convince themselves that every person can be steered, redirected, or influenced if they apply the right pressure. When they succeed a few times, that belief grows stronger. They start assuming that people are predictable and that human emotion is something that can always be manipulated with enough confidence and patience. What they fail to recognize is that their sense of power often depends on the willingness of others to keep participating in the game. As long as someone argues, defends themselves, or tries to prove their worth, the narcissist still feels in control of the situation. The illusion stays alive because the stage is still active. But that illusion is far more fragile than they realize. The moment that illusion begins to crack is usually subtle. It does not arrive with shouting or dramatic confrontation. Instead, it appears in the form of someone who refuses to react the way they expect. The narcissist might attempt the same tactics that worked before. They may withdraw attention, twist conversations, or create confusion in order to regain control of the emotional environment. Normally, these strategies produce predictable results. People become anxious, they try harder, and they chase the approval that has suddenly been withheld. That cycle strengthens the narcissist's belief that they are always several steps ahead. Yet when they encounter someone who recognizes the pattern, the response becomes very different. Instead of chasing approval, the person begins to observe. Instead of reacting emotionally, they respond calmly or sometimes not at all. This shift disrupts the rhythm the narcissist relies on. Their usual tools stop producing the same reactions, and the sense of command they once felt begins to weaken. The control they believed was natural suddenly starts to feel uncertain. What makes this realization so uncomfortable for a narcissistic personality is that their confidence is often built on repetition. If something works many times, it begins to feel like a universal truth. They start to assume that everyone can eventually be guided into the role they want them to play. But when someone refuses to follow the script, it exposes something they rarely consider. Their control was never absolute. It existed only because others continued engaging with the system they created. When a person steps outside that system, the entire dynamic changes. The narcissist may initially react with disbelief. They might attempt stronger manipulation or try to provoke emotional responses to pull the person back into familiar territory. But when those attempts fail, a quiet realization begins to form. Their influence is not as limitless as they once believed. For someone who built their identity around being in charge of every emotional situation, that discovery feels deeply unsettling because it reveals that real power does not always belong to the one trying hardest to control the outcome. There is a major difference between betraying someone who depends on your approval and betraying someone who is fully aware of their own value. A narcissistic personality often becomes comfortable mistreating people because they have learned that many individuals will stay, argue, plead, or attempt to repair the connection no matter how poorly they are treated. Over time, this creates a dangerous confidence. They begin to believe that every relationship follows the same pattern. They assume that if they cross a line, the other person will react emotionally but ultimately remain within reach. This belief encourages reckless behavior. Manipulation becomes easier. Respect becomes optional. They convince themselves that no matter what happens, they will maintain the upper hand. But this assumption collapses when the person they betray happens to be emotionally strong, self-aware, and unwilling to tolerate manipulation. When that kind of person recognizes the betrayal, the response is very different from what the narcissist expects. Instead of emotional chaos, there is clarity. Instead of endless confrontation, there is a calm decision to step away. For a narcissist, this type of response feels confusing at first. Their usual strategies rely heavily on emotional reactions. Anger, sadness, frustration, and desperation all provide opportunities for them to redirect the conversation and regain influence. When someone reacts strongly, the narcissist still feels connected to the situation. They can continue shaping the narrative and presenting themselves in whatever role benefits them most. But when the wrong person is betrayed, the emotional theater simply does not happen. The person who recognizes their worth does not spend months trying to explain why the betrayal was painful. They do not try to compete for understanding or prove their loyalty. They simply accept the information the betrayal provides and make a decision based on that truth. This quiet form of strength removes the environment where manipulation usually thrives. Suddenly, the narcissist finds themselves without the emotional leverage they normally depend on. The conversation ends faster than expected, and the relationship closes without the dramatic struggle they anticipated. What creates the lasting psychological impact is not just the loss of the relationship. It is the realization that the person they betrayed was not weak, dependent, or easily influenced. That individual understood exactly what was happening and still chose to walk away with dignity. Narcissistic personalities depend heavily on believing they are always the more perceptive person in the interaction. They pride themselves on being able to read people, predict reactions, and stay emotionally several steps ahead. When they betray someone who calmly removes themselves from the situation, that belief begins to shake. It forces them to confront a possibility they rarely consider, that the other person may have seen the manipulation clearly all along. This realization lingers because it challenges their self-image. The narcissist may try to dismiss the person who left, labeling them as cold or arrogant, but deep down, there is a quiet recognition that they misjudged the situation. And for someone who relies on the illusion of emotional superiority, discovering they were wrong about the strength of another person leaves a mark that is difficult to ignore. A narcissistic personality often confuses winning a moment with winning the entire story. In the heat of manipulation or betrayal, they may feel a strong sense of triumph. They believe they outsmarted someone, controlled the narrative, or avoided responsibility. In that moment, everything appears to be working exactly as planned. The person they hurt might look shocked, confused, or emotionally shaken, and the narcissist interprets that reaction as proof of their superiority. They walk away believing they have protected their image and secured another victory. But what they fail to recognize is that emotional consequences do not always appear immediately. Sometimes the real outcome of betrayal unfolds slowly and quietly over time. The moment that once felt like a triumph begins to look very different when the long-term results begin to appear. Relationships change, reputations shift, and the person they underestimated begins rebuilding their life without them. The temporary feeling of power slowly fades, replaced by an uncomfortable awareness that the situation did not end the way they expected. The difference between short-term victory and long-term consequence becomes clearer as time passes. Narcissists often rely on the idea that people will remain emotionally attached even after being mistreated. They assume that anger or sadness will keep the connection alive. In many situations, that assumption holds true for a while. Emotional reactions create ongoing communication, and that communication allows the narcissist to continue shaping the story. But when the wrong person is betrayed, something unexpected happens. The person who is hurt eventually reaches a point of clarity. Instead of remaining trapped in the cycle of conflict, they begin to move forward. They invest their energy in growth, stability, and new relationships that are built on respect. From the outside, this progress may look quiet and gradual, but its impact is powerful. The individual the narcissist once tried to control begins to thrive in an environment where manipulation no longer exists. This development slowly changes the meaning of the original betrayal. What once looked like a clever escape from accountability starts to resemble a serious miscalculation. The narcissist may notice that the person they hurt is no longer seeking explanations, approval, or closure. The emotional leverage that once existed disappears. Instead of being remembered as someone important in that person's life, they become part of a chapter that was closed and left behind. This realization challenges the narcissist's belief that they always maintain influence over the people they affect. A short-term victory only matters if it leads to lasting control or admiration. When the outcome is permanent distance and personal growth for the other person, the victory loses its meaning. Over time, the narcissist begins to understand that the moment they celebrated as a success may have actually been the point where they lost something valuable. That quiet recognition is difficult to accept because it reveals that their decision brought a brief feeling of power but created consequences that lasted far longer than the satisfaction they felt in the beginning. One of the most important things to understand about a narcissistic personality is how much effort goes into maintaining a carefully crafted image. Their reputation is rarely accidental. It is something they build slowly through selective storytelling, strategic charm, and constant attention to how others perceive them. They present themselves as confident, intelligent, misunderstood, or even generous depending on the environment they are in. Every detail is designed to reinforce the version of themselves they want people to believe. For a long time, this performance can be very convincing. Many people only see the surface layer, the personality that appears impressive or persuasive. Behind the scenes, however, the narcissist often relies on manipulation, blame shifting, and emotional control to maintain that image. As long as the people they affect remain silent or continue engaging in arguments, the narcissist can usually redirect the narrative and protect their reputation. But the moment the wrong person is betrayed, the system that protects that image begins to weaken in ways they did not anticipate. Exposure does not always arrive through loud accusations or public confrontations. In many cases, it begins quietly through observation and absence. When someone who once supported the narcissist suddenly steps away without dramatic conflict, others begin to notice the change. People may start asking simple questions. Why did that person leave so suddenly? Why does the story keep changing? Why do the explanations feel incomplete? The narcissist might attempt to answer these questions by reshaping the narrative, portraying themselves as misunderstood or unfairly judged. But the absence of the person they betrayed makes those explanations harder to sustain. Silence has a strange power because it removes the chaos that narcissists often use to confuse situations. Without emotional battles to distract everyone, attention slowly turns toward behavior and patterns. Over time, people begin connecting small details that once seemed unrelated. What once looked like isolated misunderstandings starts to resemble a pattern of manipulation. For someone whose identity depends heavily on admiration and control over perception, this kind of exposure feels extremely threatening. It is not simply about losing one relationship. It is about the possibility that others may begin to see beyond the image they work so hard to construct. Narcissists often believe they can repair any damage with enough persuasion, but exposure through consistent patterns is much harder to erase. When people begin forming their own conclusions instead of relying on the narcissist's explanations, the control over the narrative starts slipping away. That is why betraying the wrong person can create such a lasting impact. The individual who quietly walked away may never attempt to destroy the narcissist's reputation, yet their absence becomes a silent piece of evidence that something was not right. Over time, that quiet truth can unravel the carefully built story the narcissist depended on, leaving them face to face with a reality they can no longer fully control. One of the most misunderstood forms of strength is the decision to walk away without seeking revenge. Many people believe that when they are hurt or betrayed, the only way to restore balance is to fight back, expose the other person, or prove their side of the story with equal intensity. That reaction is understandable because betrayal naturally creates anger and a desire for justice. But when dealing with a narcissistic personality, retaliation often feeds the very system that keeps them powerful. Narcissists are highly skilled at turning conflict into a stage where they can redirect blame, twist facts, and present themselves as misunderstood victims. The louder the argument becomes, the more opportunities they have to reshape the narrative. This is why the quiet decision to step away can become one of the most powerful responses a person can make. Instead of entering a prolonged battle of explanations and accusations, the person who recognizes manipulation simply removes themselves from the environment where that manipulation operates. For a narcissist, this type of response can be extremely unsettling. Their usual strategies depend heavily on emotional engagement. They expect arguments, emotional reactions, and repeated attempts from the other person to repair the relationship or defend themselves. Those reactions provide energy for the conflict and allow the narcissist to maintain influence over the situation. When someone refuses to play that role, the dynamic suddenly changes. There is no argument to win and no emotional chaos to control. The narcissist may attempt to provoke a reaction through criticism, rumors, or attempts to re-enter the conversation, hoping to pull the person back into familiar territory. But when the other individual remains calm and distant, the manipulative tactics lose much of their power. The stage that once allowed the narcissist to dominate the situation disappears, leaving them without the audience they relied on to maintain their sense of authority. Walking away without revenge also sends a quiet but powerful message about self-respect. It demonstrates that the person who is betrayed does not need to destroy someone else in order to restore their own dignity. Instead, they focus on protecting their peace, rebuilding their life, and moving forward with clarity. This approach removes the narcissist's ability to define the outcome of the situation. Instead of being remembered as someone who caused endless conflict, the narcissist becomes part of a closed chapter that no longer receives attention or emotional investment. Over time, this silence can become more uncomfortable than any confrontation would have been. The narcissist may continue searching for ways to regain influence or provoke a reaction, but the absence of engagement makes those attempts ineffective. What remains is a quiet reminder that the person they tried to manipulate chose freedom instead of revenge, and that decision quietly dismantles the power the narcissist once believed they held over the entire situation. One of the most difficult concepts for a narcissistic personality to understand is genuine accountability. In healthy relationships, accountability means acknowledging harm, accepting responsibility, and showing a willingness to repair what was damaged. It requires humility, empathy, and the ability to see a situation from another person's perspective. But for someone whose identity is built around superiority and control, admitting fault feels threatening to their entire self-image. Instead of accepting responsibility, they often develop complex ways to avoid it. They may shift blame, rewrite events, minimize the damage, or portray themselves as misunderstood. Over time, this pattern becomes automatic. Whenever conflict appears, their instinct is not to reflect on their behavior, but to search for explanations that protect their ego. The goal is always the same: preserve the image of being right, strong, and above criticism. As long as this system works, the narcissist never has to confront the uncomfortable truth that their actions may have caused real harm. When someone confronts them about betrayal or manipulation, the narcissist's response usually follows a predictable path. First comes denial, where they question whether the event even happened the way it was described. If denial becomes difficult to maintain, they may shift toward justification, explaining why their behavior was necessary or provoked by someone else. In many cases, they also attempt to redirect the conversation by focusing on the other person's reactions rather than their own actions. The discussion slowly moves away from the original issue and turns into an argument about tone, timing, or misunderstanding. This strategy allows them to avoid the central point, which is their responsibility for the situation. Because this pattern repeats in many relationships, narcissists begin believing they can escape accountability indefinitely. They assume that if they argue long enough or create enough confusion, the pressure to take responsibility will eventually fade. Unfortunately for them, this belief creates a serious blind spot when they encounter someone who refuses to participate in that cycle. When the wrong person is betrayed, the dynamic changes completely. Instead of chasing explanations or debating every detail, the individual simply observes the pattern and draws a conclusion. They recognize that true accountability is not being offered, and rather than wasting energy trying